So today we're going to talk about elasticity. Elasticity is effectively the measure of the responsiveness of quantity demanded and quantity supply, and effectively how that responds to changes in price. So what does that really mean? So effectively for demand, when you're thinking about demand, think about how the quantity of demand responds to a change in the price of a good. And effectively what we're trying to say there is that as the price of a good changes, what does that do to quantity demanded or quantity supplied? Okay, so that's kind of the general definition of elasticity. But the most important thing, and the thing you'll encounter most frequently on exams, is something where you're asked to compute the price elasticity of demand or the price elasticity of supply. Okay, so let's take a look at what that formula is first. So effectively the formula is Q2 minus Q1, and then that is divided by Q2 plus Q1, and then that is divided by 2. And that is all over the price, so in this case, P2 over P1, and that's over P2 plus P1 divided by 2. Okay, so we have a pretty good idea of the formula for elasticity. And so now why don't we try and apply this to a problem? Okay, so let's think of an example problem. So why don't we have, I'll list some, so Q1 in this example is going to be, let's say 400. Q2 in this example is going to be 500. P2, P1 in this example is going to be, let's say, a price of $4. And P2 in this example is going to be a price of $5. Okay. So now that we have these quantities, how are we going to, quantities and prices, how are we going to translate this into this? Well, it's actually pretty easy. So all we're going to do is just take this formula and plug these quantities into that formula. So it's going to look something like this. And I'm just going to copy the formula so we don't have to redo the entire thing. And the nice thing about, specifically about the quantity formula is effectively that, or the elasticity formula is effectively that this formula is the same for elasticity of demand and elasticity of supply. So the nice thing is, regardless of if these quantities are for demand or supply, this formula is going to stay exactly constant. Okay, so we have 500 minus 400, and we're going to divide that by the 500 plus 400, and that's going to be divided by, in this case, 2. Okay, so that's going to be all taken over the price of $5 minus the price of $4, and that's going to be divided by effectively 5 plus 4, and then that's all going to be taken over 2. Okay, so now why don't we calculate that, and we can see what the elasticity for these particular quantities and prices are. Okay, so after we've done the calculation, we will find that the elasticity is effectively, in this case, 1. So that effectively means that this is unit elastic. Okay, so now why don't we talk about what the elasticity actually means at different points. Okay, so for this example, we have the elasticity of 1. So that's going to be our answer for that. So what does that mean? Effectively, that means that the price and quantity change in tandem. So if the elasticity is 1, that effectively means that it is unit elastic, and price and quantity change at the same rate. So if there is a change in price, there's going to be the exact same change in quantity. Okay, so an elasticity of 1 is pretty uncommon. So why don't we go over some more common examples? So if something is less than 1, that effectively means that it is inelastic. So that is something that is inelastic. And if something is inelastic, what that effectively means is that the change in price is going to be greater than the change in quantity. So let's write that down. So change in price is greater than a change in the quantity. And what that's effectively saying, and specifically to inelastic goods, is that the price changes, but it's hard for consumers to stop consuming the good, or it's hard for producers to stop producing the good. And goods like this are normally necessities, so things that people need. When people need something, it's hard for them to either A, substitute away from the good, or B, just stop consuming it at all. So that's something that is inelastic. Okay, so finally, we're going to have something called elastic, which is going to be greater than 1. And so that's going to be elastic. And that effectively means that the change in price is going to be actually less than the change in quantity. So the change in price is less than a change in quantity. So in this case, that something can be something like luxury goods. So frequently elastic goods are luxury goods, or things that consumers don't really need. They're goods that consumers can stop consuming, and it's not something that is particularly detrimental to them. Okay, so we've kind of covered the basics of elasticity of demand. We've learned that this formula is true for elasticity of supply and demand. Nothing changes. The elasticity is true, so unit elastic, inelastic, inelastic, those are effectively true for demand and supply as well. Okay, so why don't we talk about something that's a little more complicated, but it's going to be using the same formula. Okay, so let's talk about cross price elasticity. So cross price elasticity is effectively trying to get you to see how much the quantity demanded of one good responds to a change in the price of another good. So effectively, rather than having the same good, we need to have the quantity, so the quantity of, let's say, good X and the price of good Y. So this is really important for cross-price elasticity. You need to have the quantity of one good and the price of another good. Okay, so why don't we do an example of that has the price for one good and the quantity for another good. Okay, so let's say that we have the quantity 1 for good X, and then we're also going to have the quantity 2 for good X, because to compute elasticity, you need 2 points. You're going to have the price 1 for good Y, and you're going to have price 2 for good Y. So this is what you need to compute cross-price elasticity. Okay, so let's say that we have those, and let's give ourselves those numbers. Okay, so for the price, let's say the P1 is going to be $2 and the P1 is going to be $2 and P2 is going to be $3. And let's say that the quantity is going to be effectively at Q1 20 units and 40 units. Okay, so now we have our quantities and information. So now why don't we try and see if we can plug those into our formula. Okay, so once again, the same formula. So now we're just going to effectively put in 40, 20, once again, 40 and 20. And we're getting these numbers from over here. So for P2, that is going to be $3. And for P1, it's going to be $2. Once again, for P2, $3. And for P1, it's going to be $2. Perfect. Okay, so we filled out our formula with the information that we were provided. Now why don't we try to work through this problem? Okay, so now that we've computed this, the effective cross-price elasticity is going to be 0.825. Okay. And this, just kind of a good general note for elasticity, is frequently, so for the upper portion of the problem, when you take everything, so when you take the quantity, you get 0.333. Effectively, we're going to round that, which is for elasticity is really important. You'll frequently get numbers that are infinite numbers, and so they're just effectively continuing on. You can truncate those to make them a little simpler to solve. So then we have 5.4. And that effectively equals 0.825. Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, so let's take a look. So we have two types of goods for cross-price elasticity. We have substitutes, which are goods that are used in place of one another. So in this case, a good example could potentially be something like tea or coffee. Both are things that give you caffeine. Some people prefer coffee, some people prefer tea, but in this case, they're two goods that you can substitute for one another. And so substitutes have a positive, effectively, cross-price elasticity. So in this case, we know that these two goods are effectively substitutes. Okay, so what happens if it's negative? So if it's negative, the goods are going to be complements. And complements are goods that are used together. And they have a negative cross-price elasticity. And so complements being goods that are used together could be something like coffee or cream, or coffee and milk, or coffee and sugar. Effectively, when you use one good, you use the other good. Whereas for substitutes, you use either one good or the other good, but not both. And so for complements, we have negative cross-price elasticity. So if this was a negative number, it would be a complement. If it's a positive number, it's going to be a substitute. So effectively for elasticity, we've covered the elasticity of demand and supply. We've also covered cross-price elasticity. The most important thing I think to take away from this, though, is effectively the fact that you have something like this. And this is the formula for elasticity. And so this formula is critically important. This formula is true for both the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply, as well as cross-price elasticity. So this formula does not change. The only thing that changes is for the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply, you have the quantity and price for the same good. For cross price elasticity, you have the quantity for one good and the price for another good. And otherwise, you're just going to plug the numbers in and interpret what the elasticity is telling you. So whether it's cross price elasticity for substitutes and complements, or if it is elasticity for demand and supply, it's either going to be unit elastic, inelastic, or elastic.